estão nesse lugar tão interessante. Vou dar, então, a palavra a ele e depois farei a introdução do professor Rainer Kattel, que nos está esperando.
Boa tarde a todos e a todas. Obrigado, professora Ana Célia. Muito obrigado aí por escolher, né, a UNILA para fazermos este evento. Muito obrigado aqui também pelo convite, em nome do professor Gleison, que ele está de férias, né? Eu vim em representação da reitoria. Bom, eu gostaria apenas de reforçar esse nosso interesse institucional em temáticas tão relevantes quanto aquela do evento e do próprio instituto. A ciência e a tecnologia hoje aplicada às políticas públicas, às políticas estratégicas, as políticas de desenvolvimento são fundamentais, principalmente neste nosso momento político atual, professora. Então, a gente fica muito grato, muito feliz de que eventos desta natureza se levem a cabo em nossa universidade, ainda mais com a própria temática do evento em si, né? Só relembrando aqui que a temática é a reconstrução das capacidades estatais, novas coalições e visões e futuro em América Latina. Me corrige se estou errado, professora. Mas é muito alinhada com tudo aquilo que nós, como Universidade Federal da Integração Latino-Americana, procuramos para a nossa sociedade, né? Então, nós temos como missão essa integração latino-americana através da academia, formando pessoas profissionais que não apenas tenham uma competência técnica suficiente, mas também uma capacidade crítica de contribuir na nossa sociedade, né? Então, com certeza, estes espaços de discussão, de análise, contribuem muito nessa nossa missão. Então, ficamos muito gratos, né? Parabéns aí aos organizadores, parabéns, então, também a toda a equipe, né, que conseguiu juntar aqui esse esforço, eu diria que até internacional, né, participação internacional. E, bom, seria apenas isso para não estender muito. Desejo para vocês um bom evento e muito sucesso. E, bom, como sempre, temos que citar, né? Esperamos que o Brasil ganhe hoje no jogo. Obrigado.
Rainer, I can't see you. I can't see you. Are you
okay,
there?
I can see you, yeah. I can see you and hear you.
Okay,
good,
thank
good.
you. Well, I'm going to speak in English now. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Rainer Kattel, one of the most remarkable authorities in organizational and institutional aspects of innovation and innovation policies. Professor Rainer Kattel is Professor of Innovation and Public Governance of the Institute for Innovation and Public Purpose in University of City of London. And he is going to introduce to us his new book. It's a remarkable book. And the book is this one, How to Make an Entrepreneurial State and Why Innovation Needs Bureaucracy. I'm reading the book. It's fantastic. You really should. It's exactly what we need now at this moment of rebuilding state capacity. Why innovation needs bureaucracy is this about? Is all this about? So Professor Rainer also works together with Mariana Mazzucato, and in this Institute for Public Purpose of the UCL, they are building really an extremely important reflection on skills, networks, organizations, and both agility and stability. And they are working on this institutional aspects of bureaucracy and how the Weberian approach to bureaucracy must be accompanied by, must be followed by this idea of the state has to have capacities, has to have innovation capacities to fulfill his role after the pandemic, and in Brazil at this moment, so difficult moment, that we have to rebuild all the policies and institutions that were, in a certain sense, dismantled by the last government. So this is extremely important reflection, extremely important thought about the role of the state. And now I give the word for Professor Heiner Kattel for his presentation on how to make an entrepreneurial state and why innovation needs bureaucracy. This is the book.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. And yeah, and I hope everybody can see me. Oh yeah, I can see myself behind Anna Sela there. Good. So yeah, thanks for this very kind introduction, Anna, as well. And I'm always very glad to be in Brazil, even though I'm on virtually today. There's lots of friends, and I think there's lots of good things happening again in Brazil. I'm very glad for you. And so yeah, I'll talk. Are you seeing my slides as well? Oh yeah, okay, the slides are there. And so I'll do a talk on my book or the themes of the book, and I call it Mission Possible: Why Innovation Needs Bureaucracy to Tackle the Grand Challenges. Yeah, so you already saw the book, and yes, I will talk to the themes of the book. So I won't do the talk to the entire book, because the book has lots of historical discussions as well. So I will try to do more like almost like implications of the book for the future of bureaucracy and the future of innovation, rather than just the book of the themes of the book. But I'm happy to answer your questions and take comments, of course, later on as well. And I'll talk about maybe 25 minutes, 30 minutes, and then I'm happy to take questions and comments. And I know that you have a soccer match coming up later today, so I don't want to be between you and the soccer, of course. So I think the beginning of today's discussion, very much I think across the world really, is that we are in this polycrisis, or we can call it like the music producer Brian Eno calls it, the long now. And that means that governments have dual tasks really. So they have to think about immediate crises, like the war and inflation or COVID, but also, of course, climate emergency in the form of like forest fires or flooding or migration waves because of a climate emergency. And like you now see in Pakistan, where 30 million people have been dislocated because of the flooding. So governments have to worry about this extremely emergent crisis, but at the same time, of course, all of those crises need a longer-term solution as well. You need to decarbonize the economy. We need to think about how do we solve the war in Ukraine, or how do we solve the tensions between China and the US, and so on and so forth. So I think there are these dual tasks that governments need to take advantage of or solve. And so at the moment we are very much thinking that we are like right-handed or left-handed, short-term or long-term. But I think we need to really look at the government capabilities together. We need to be ambidextrous. We need to be both-handed in government organizations, short and long-term. And that's why I think it's really important to think about what are the capabilities and capacities actually government organizations need to take advantage of that. What kind of bureaucracy we need to solve both immediate crises and long-term solutions as well. And of course, this goes in hand with this idea that when we talk about innovation, we don't talk about it anymore not only in the sense of research and development and economic growth or exports or foreign direct investments or technology, but it's also very much about how innovation can help us solve or change our technical systems like food systems or mobility and transportation. So it's not only about technology, but it's also about human behavior. And of course, when we talk about behavior, this is very much a political discussion as well. How we citizens think about the future of food, future of transportation, and so on and so forth. So innovation has become a politically very important topic, or it should be politically very important topic. Let me put it like that. But on the other hand, when we look at the civil service, of course, there is we usually see that civil service is very much focusing on following the rules and being quite careful. And here is an example or a citation from Kate Bingham. She was the head of UK's vaccine task force. So she has a background in venture capital, and she was put in charge of the vaccine task force. And as we know, the vaccine task force was extremely successful. They developed a vaccine within less than a year. But what she saw was that actually civil servants are not really rewarded being innovative. So the infrastructure, the civil services we have today is very much focusing on stability and rather than agility or dynamisms. And so we are looking to deal with very much transparency of government rather than actually innovating. And so, of course, this is the challenge we have to overcome. And if you look at the innovation agencies also in Brazil, for instance, like FINEP and others, are they actually innovating, or are they actually just supporting others to innovate? Universities, private companies. And I think this is really where the key task for government agencies is. Can we actually move into this phase of innovating ourselves or being involved in innovations ourselves, rather than only supporting others to innovate? And I think this is a key change. And I'm sure you might have heard about the ancient Greek joke about the hedgehog and the fox. And this was then made famous by a British philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, in 1950s, when he wrote about this idea of hedgehog and fox. And the point is that the fox knows many small things about many things, but the hedgehog knows one thing only. And I think our current bureaucracy is very much like a hedgehog. It does one thing well if it does something well. It does one thing where it's very specialized bureaucracy. When we have like a transportation department in the city, they deal with transportation, right? They don't deal with anything else, even the impact of transportation on health or on the economy. They only look at the transportation, and so on and so forth. So the way the government organized and functions today is very much specialized according to the division of labor or departments, however we want to see. So it's very difficult for departments to do something that is not within their specializations. This is, of course, something that we want to change. And that's what I think, and as Anna Sela mentioned as well, and this is the key message of the book, that public organizations need to be both agile and stable, or, focusing on providing agile crisis response, trying to shape markets in terms of tackling the climate emergency, for instance, but also providing the long-term stability in societies, building long-term institutions, infrastructure like service, digital infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So this is the dual task of public government organizations. And that's beautifully put again by Brian Eno, and he's a music producer, and he said a couple of years ago that bureaucrats are very much the sort of stabilizing knowledge in society, and keep things running, keep our systems, social systems, technological systems running, and then radically innovating from time to time as well. And what we're trying to do today is to understand what kind of bureaucracies actually can innovate and how they can innovate. And I will also put to you that that when we talk about development in the context of Latin America, for instance, or Africa, development is always about structural change in societies. We want societies to move into higher value added, higher knowledge content, higher technological activities. But that also required in today's area, I would argue, a new kind of entrepreneurial state 2.0. So we can't just copy the entrepreneurial state of 1960s and 70s, but we need to think about the new kinds of entrepreneurial state. And this is what I will talk more specifically to you about. So, because I would argue that public sector needs to innovate in three different ways, and I will talk about those three different ways. And I would also argue that these three different ways of innovation require different types of bureaucracies, because we come from in 20th century and large part of the 19th century, most government organizations were very similar across the government. We built the bureaucracy in the same blueprint. We thought about the civil service. We thought about how do we promote, how do we educate people. It was pretty much the same across the government. But I think now we are in different era. I think we need to have different kinds of bureaucracies for different kinds of innovations. And I will talk about that today in more detail. And I will use the metaphor for these different kinds of organizations developed by a German philosopher, Friedrich Nietzsche. I'm sure you have read at one point in high school or later in university his book about Zarathustra, which was famously the nihilistic book of Nietzsche, very late Nietzsche, but still what it provides us with is this very interesting a metaphor for transformation of the spirit, and namely that how the spirit is a camel, lion, and a child. And I would argue that public sector also requires three different kind of organizations that are like camels, organizations that are like lions, and organizations that are like children. And what do I mean by that? So first of all, I think public sector needs organizations that take care of the routine, everyday tasks of public sector. There are many tasks in public sector that are very routine and everyday, like just looking at the safety on the streets, garbage collection. They're very routine tasks that the public sector needs to do on a day-to-day basis. But then there are also tasks that are very much around missions or new challenges that we have to solve. How do we change our food systems, for instance? How do we change our agriculture? And these require, in my opinion, very different kind of organizations. They have like lots. I'll talk about that in a minute. And also we need experimentation. We need to find new solutions. And these are, again, very different kind of organizations, I would argue. And let's see now all of those different organizational types one by one. And then at the end, I'll try to pull it together and show what are the dynamic capabilities for these all organizations are required. So these are the quotes from Friedrich Nietzsche when he talks about why do we need camels, what camels do as spirit of our when we are a camel. So, and this is what he says, is that what is heavy asks the carrying spirit. It kneels down like a camel and wants to be loaded. So it's public organizations that can carry a lot of loads, a lot of tasks, and on a day-to-day basis. They don't get tired, if you will. And so these are public institutions that are there for a very long time, and they provide the same features all the time. Here is an example from a Roman bathhouse in Northern Africa, in Morocco, which has been operating since 2000 years. It's the same task, which is a public health function. People can come together, they can clean themselves, but they can also discuss, be a community together, basically. But think about this, has been doing the same function for 2000 years. At one point, it was a very radical innovation to create a public bath. And as we know, the Roman Empire was very good at building some of those institutions like public baths, and that were in functioning for a very long time. But think about something like this functioning for 2000 years and doing the same thing every day. So you don't really need be very innovative around it, but you need to provide a very good quality service. You need to make sure that water is clean, that there are no problems, people can come in and out, and all of those things. Of course, you need to have a very good quality standards of work, but it's the same kind of work day in and day out. And of course, you have similar functions, for instance, like in public housing, providing public housing for people who need it. Here is an example from Singapore, actually. And as you might know, Singapore has the world's best public housing program, because it's a very small landlocked or a sea-locked country that has very few square meters of land, actually. So land is very expensive. It makes a lot of sense to provide public housing, because then you avoid all kinds of speculation around land and financialization of real estate and so on and so forth. Again, it was a radical innovation at one point, but now it's not an innovation anymore. It's a routine public sector task that needs to be, of course, provided on a very high quality. But again, it's something that it's there every day. You don't need to sort of think about it, but you need to provide a good service. But we can also think about digital infrastructure. So my own country, Estonia, I come originally from Estonia. Estonia has a very good digital infrastructure. It provides very good digital services for signature, signing. All contracts can be done electronically. Accessing all services can be done electronically. Accessing bank accounts, all those things can be done electronically. It's a very good infrastructure. It doesn't do much else, but it's a very good digital infrastructure that's been stable for 25 years almost by now. So it's something that doesn't really change on a day-to-day basis. There is no sort of agility needed, if you will, or no dynamism in that sense. But there is a very strong need for quality public services that are, carried out day in and day out. And I would call, following Max Weber here, that these are expert bureaucracies. So these are expert-based bureaucracies. If you want to build a house, if you want to build digital infrastructure, if you want to build bridges, you need experts who can do that, who can deliver this quality innovation and then quality service along throughout the time. But these are experts. So we hire engineers, we hire software engineers, and so on and so forth, who can deliver these kind of public organizations and public services. And as I said, these are really fundamental to the public sector. But these are innovations that maybe happen every 50 years or every 20 years, or and so on and so forth. So they are not really innovations that happen every month or every other half a year or something like that. But now when we talk about the lion, remember the Nietzsche's metaphor. So when the spirit becomes a lion, so this is somebody who wants to free itself, wants to do something new, to say no to these day-to-day routines and want to, innovate, if you will. So it says no to duty. So this is the organizations I think that are actually trying to create something entirely new in the very peak systems that we are living in, socio-technical systems. And this is where we find mission-oriented innovation is located. And as you know, if I go back to the origins of mission-oriented innovation, so they come from military and security missions from 1960s and 1970s between the USSR and the USA on both sides of the Iron Wall, and in the Cold War. And of course, this is what we know, that these are mission-oriented organizations that are very much driven by military needs, very innovative, very fast-moving, but at the same time, of course, also invested a lot of money into basic science and research, but also applied science. And out of that came the iPhone on the one side of the iron, end of the Cold War, and on the other hand, we have Skype. Skype came from Estonia, and it was initially the first investments into Estonian ICT infrastructure was made in 1960 into the Institute of Cybernetics by Soviet Union, that later became the key sort of the know-how and the hub for Skype and its similar technologies. So we know that in the past this worked, but today we are in a time where we have an entirely new generation of mission-oriented innovation is emerging. So we have both, you see here is a mission-oriented research and innovation in the European Union, which is very much focused on R&D, the side of innovation. But we also have private organizations focusing on missions, trying to do something really new in space rates. XPRIZE is a private space mission, actually. But you also see private sector companies focusing on societal impact, how they can generate more impact. And below you see a 3 missions from Innovation Foundation here in the UK, from Nesta. So there's lots of organizations trying to be very mission-oriented, solving problems, and through these solving problems, providing spillovers into society, into new jobs and technological solutions and new companies and whatnot. But these are organizations, I would argue, that are very much driven by different kind of expertise. And here is an example from a mission-oriented solution today from Sweden. So Swedish innovation agency Vinnova is focusing on how do we make every street in Sweden healthy and sustainable and vibrant. So if you think about it, Sweden has 40,000 streets. So they're focusing, how do we make the entire system around streets much more healthy, sustainable, and vibrant. So that means that we have to transform every street by street in Sweden. And how do we do that? We have to learn how to do that together with communities, companies, universities, all of those people who are actually around those streets. And of course, as I said, the expert-based bureaucracy is very much focusing on what they know. So here is, if you have a traffic department in a city, they see the street very much through the perspective of traffic. So they want to get less or more efficient traffic on the street. But if you think about, how do we bring together everybody who actually is working around those streets? We have public health, we have commerce, we have culture, we have logistics, we have retailers, we have real estate. All of those things are actually on the street, and of course mobility as well. But there is a much different actually value that we can provide as a society. So we need to we can't anymore be focusing on our specialization as a siloed organization, but we have to bring those two organizations together somehow and work on a very different kind of street, because we want to transform all those streets. because of the ecological impact. And so this is the visual of the work they are doing, literally going street by street and taking space away from cars, building space for bicycles, building space for commerce. And as you might know, there's lots of these ideas around cities. How do we transform cities into 15-minute cities, 10-minute cities, meaning that all the services that you might need to be in 10 or 15 minutes walking distance. That requires, of course, transforming all those cities away from cars into something entirely different. And that requires a very different kind of bureaucracy, because it requires a big belief in what you do. And I would argue that this requires an activist bureaucracy. You need to have a bureaucracy, civil servants who are really believing in their mission and are willing to invest themselves in the mission and willing to talk to and engage a huge number of stakeholders, not only businesses, but also community groups, children, schools, all those people. They are willing to engage with them and spend lots of time in engaging and getting, motivating, inspiring people. So it's not about specializing and doing specific tasks really well, but it's actually inspiring, getting people on board. So you need a different kind of organization, because this is not the task for engineers. This is task for somebody who has a different kind of personality also. How do you find them? You need to create a different kind of institutions. And this is what, Vinnova has been trying to do. They have been trying to hire different people into their organization. They're, providing a different ways of working and all that. So it requires really an organizational transformation to become much more activist rather than being a specialized agency. And of course, now we have the third type of bureaucracy, which is the child. And again, we come back to our old friend Friedrich Nietzsche, talking about the transformation into the child. And the child is very much the innocence, the new beginning, forgetting, being very playful, as we know from children. So it's very much something that is very new and very experimental, as I said. So when we talk about this kind of organizations, I bring in here an example from UK. This is a UK government. How does it look in the digital space? All information is basically on one website, which is called gov.uk. But of course, if you look at it, it doesn't look anything very special. But what it does is imitates the same kind of experience as you would go to Google. So if you go to Google, you don't know which department, which organization is providing you the information. You put in your question in the search. It's the same thing in here in the UK government. So if I need an answer to my question, I just put it in the search. So a couple of weeks ago, I needed to renew my residency here in the UK. So I just typed in, how do I renew my residency? It guided me towards a specific website. I did everything. In 12 hours later, residency requirements were renewed. I had no idea which department it was, who were the people behind it. I had no idea. I just filled out the question, I want to renew my residency permit, and that's how it happens. So it is a very radically different experience, and there's no digital identity, so you don't need to log into anything. So it's a very innovative, very radical solution. And how do they do it? They really had this very focus on the, how do we actually think of the government in the digital space? But they were very much focusing on the user, what kind of needs the citizens actually have in digital space. So if you look at the typical government has maybe 500, 600 services that can be online. Many governments try them all online, which makes no sense because people actually use maybe 20, 25 services, like renewing passport, all of those very, kind of mundane, simple things. But you really need those services to be very good. They need to be online. You need to find the information very quickly. So they created very small teams, very agile teams that were very quickly trying to create those services, put them online, and learn very quickly. So they hire people from startups, for software engineers, designers, all those people who are very good at understanding user needs. But it's a very focused public organization trying to solve, again, quite a specific problem. But of course, underneath it, they also really transformed the entire procurement system. So here is the UK before the digital transformation reforms. And you see on the left-hand side, you see that almost 80% of UK digital procurement went to south of the country for 10 companies, and they spent almost like 15 billion pounds on those companies. After the reforms, you have 5,000 getting the government contracts, small companies, and getting government contracts. And so those small teams in governments were able to reform the entire public procurement processes as well. So it became very much a very vibrant marketplace for digital services. This is one of the UK, or this made UK one of the leading digital nations in the world. So I would call this is a very entrepreneurial bureaucracy. So it starts to look for small things. What can we do to change our user experience and learn from that very quickly? So that this, if you go back to this Cov.uk, the first version of that was created in 12 weeks. It cost less than £200,000, but it was a very quick, very easy product to create. But it was exactly this mentality of creating a product for a customer. And of course, this is something that works again in special places, but it was very experimental way of working and experimental way of bringing people in. So I would argue that these three different kinds of bureaucracies, there is something in common to them, and this is what I would call the idea of dynamic capabilities. And this is a famous definition from David Tees, who has worked around dynamic capabilities for businesses. And here's this idea that dynamic capabilities are higher order bundles of organizational routines and managerial decisions that drive strategic activities of the business enterprise competing in regimes of deep uncertainty. And I would take this definition and if you apply it to the public sector, I would argue that dynamic capabilities of public sector or public organizations that we just talked about are higher order bundles of political policy and organizational routines and managerial decisions that drive the strategic activities of public organizations in regimes of deep uncertainty and wicked challenges. And I would argue that there are pretty much three types of public dynamic capabilities that are really relevant to all types of bureaucracy. They might be in different degrees and in different kinds, but there are three types of dynamic capabilities. And first, I think there are the sense-making capabilities. How do we get away from being a very specialized traffic department that only sees traffic? How do we understand our own field of activity in a much wider sense? And this is very much about sense-making. So, and here is an example from a tweet recently about Paris. As you might know, Paris is very much focusing on transforming the city space away from cars towards bicycle and pedestrian, walking. And here is you see the street in Paris, and there's hardly any cars left. Actually, this is one of the big boulevards. But it's really about having those analytical capabilities to understand a street from a very different perspective, not only just from cars and mobility, but really actually looking at the street as a place where we want to meet and get together. So how do you get there? You need not only economists and planners and traffic people, but you really need apologists and people like that to make sense of what you're actually trying to do. So I think sense-making capabilities are key for all organizations in the public sector. But also connecting capabilities are very, very key. And here is an example from Mexico City, actually. They built almost 10 years ago an experimental lab within the city. And it was really about bringing communities into city planning and developing together with communities that are usually not part of city planning. And how do we actually, again, turn the city into much more livable, human-centered place rather than something that is very much a big infrastructure, big commerce, and big transportation. But actually, how do we live better in the cities, which is very much engaging with community and learning from communities. And they did that extremely well over the last 20 years. And you have similar examples, interestingly, in Latin America, like in Bogota and other places, where these kind of experiments are very much focusing on getting people into policymaking that they are usually not. For instance, when we talk about care economy, which is very much about actually getting women involved in policymaking, because carers tend to be mostly women. So how do we actually liberate them from the care work or make the care work easier? And it really requires engaging with them. So it's really connecting capabilities, but it's also coordinating across public sector activities that is really important. And then I would also argue that this is very much, you need to be able to implement, to shape things actually as well, to actually, change procurement laws, if you will, to take advantage of the things you want to do. And here is an example from Taiwan during the COVID crisis. They noticed that there were actually hackers, software engineers providing small apps that showed where can we get masks in the city, which pharmacy still has masks. And this was done by private people, essentially. And what the government did was what they called reverse procurement. They procured those solutions to be available in public for everybody. So it's actually having those capabilities of using procurement funding very quickly in a matter of weeks and turning it around into a new solution. So I think this is, even when we talk about these different kind of bureaucracies, they all require, I would argue, these kind of capabilities to be built into those organizations in order to take advantage of that. And here is an example of how UNDP actually tries to implement these kind of ideas of sense making and reframing of policy problems and positioning and transforming them. And I think it's an interesting example of how even big organizations like UNDP and their programs are trying to reorient themselves from just supporting countries to do something, but actually providing them with new sense-making capabilities and new sort of positioning and transforming capabilities as well. And I think this is sort of concluding more or less my speech here, because I would argue very much, as I said, that public organizations need to have, or innovation in government requires this diverse bureaucracies. We need routine bureaucracies, we need mission-oriented bureaucracies, and we need experimentation-oriented bureaucracies. We need camels and lions and children. But across those organizations, we need in different degrees, but we still need those dynamic capabilities of sense-making, connecting and coordinating, and actually being able to shape and implement policies, but to a different degree. Thank you very much. I hope it was understandable across the continents here, and very much looking forward to your comments and questions. Oh, I can't hear. Still can't hear you. Yeah, digital age. I can't hear you still. Oh, no, I can hear. Now I can.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
okay.
I can hear now.
Okay. So before giving the word for the public, for the audience here, I want to make some remarks, because I came to this lecture with several questions. Starting to reading your book, you are in the search for the bullet silver. And I think you found it in the concept of, in the very useful concept of stability, of agile stability. I think that this concept for the new capabilities, the new state capabilities, it's extremely useful. The idea of agile stability that will combine routines, missions, and experimentation. And I think that this is really important at this moment, because we have really to rebuild all state capabilities, state capacities. And looking at the critical uncertainties, I think we'll face at this moment in rebuilding state capacities, it will be, we are facing two different critical uncertainties. And the first one, I think you have answer. What are the new necessary capabilities that the state will have to face the future, to face the challenges of the future? So this is really, we don't know. What are the new necessary capabilities? I think that you gave, in a certain sense, an answer by the concepts of sensing-making capabilities, shaping capabilities, and the other concepts you develop at the very end. But there is another, or a second, critical uncertainty that we really do not, we can't find in the book, is how to reconcile this society divided by opposite visions of the future. I mean, the election and also the last government really put Brazilian society in two different sides, into unreconciled sides, and how the state could have some ways to face this division and to rebuild and to reconcile society, and also be able to build new consensus, new structural consensus. And this is a question that I leave for you. And maybe I should give the word for the public, or you want to answer this before?
Up to you. We can do it both ways. Yeah, thank you so much, Anna, for these very kind words. And yeah, I think your question is indeed the most critical one in many ways, about the politics, and particularly about the divided politics. And I think there are probably like multiple answers or parts of the answer to that question. Like, one is really I think we have to be able to focus again on communities, rather than perhaps only think about like mass politics, mass parties, which are very much this like a 20th century idea that we think that the political parties are able to challenge, not challenge, but channel political interest from the citizens to political machinery, if you will. And I think there's a lot of things are being lost today because of the way that the news cycles work and everything like that. So I think we have to think about really how communities become again where places where things can be discussed in a meaningful or peaceful way, and where solutions can be sought. So that might actually require, thinking on the level of communities and cities, whether we need new political institutions of discussion. And I think these are the examples, for instance, from Bogota or Mexico City, where there's this engagement that's become so important. And I think this is an interesting example. And the other part of my answer to that would be that I think the governments need to have a much better understanding how harmful digital platforms can be to societal debates. So there, I think we need to really have a very serious think about what do we do with places like Facebook and others. Now you have Twitter, which is in private hands, and we see that Twitter is really disintegrating as a place of debate, while at the same time, of course, this integration is still sowing the division rather than consensus. So I think we need to somehow think about rebuilding the digital public space for discussion, which I think has now, it's almost entirely in the private sector. It's either Facebook, Twitter, and other places. I don't think it has to be publicly owned. In China, it is publicly owned largely, or owned by companies that have a very strong state backing. But I think we need to think about, again, digital platforms that are very much owned in a community or commons type of way. And I know this is very difficult, but this is where I would look at. We're trying to solve those political divisions. Thank you.
Now I open the floor for everybody. Yes, please, Francisco, come here.
Oh yeah, you have to come in front so I can see you.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Francisco. I'm a professor of public policy management in Universidade de Brasília, our capital. So I'm going to straight to the point. In few years, I think we are going to face a huge discussion again. It's already happened in Brazil about the administrative reform, a great administrative reform again, like in the 1990s. So do you think we can reach this kind of innovation in public service, trying to lead a new great public reform, and take into consideration the three types of public servants, public bureaucracy you have cited? What do you think about the hiring system of public servants? What kind of new systems of hiring public servants, we gotta need to like think about these like very stability, agile,
Right,
agile
agile stability.
So that's the two questions I would like
Thank
to
you.
hear.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And yeah, as you said, there is a.
2 more questions and then you answer, please.
Okay.
John.
Okay. Cool.
Hello, Harney. Nice to see you again. Congrats for your book. I really want to read your new book. But my question is that could you stress the difference between your model about innovative bureaucracies from the new public management model, and tell more how does your model of innovative bureaucracies fit with the thinking about Newberian bureaucracies?
Mm-hmm.
Did you get that?
Yeah, thank you. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Answer now, and I have 2 by 2.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks. Excellent questions, and I think in many ways they are almost very similar actually about new public management. Of course, the 1990s reforms that were very much about public sector reform, and I would argue that I think the key challenge or the key mistake, if you will, of new public management reforms was that it was the idea that all public sector needs the same kind of reform, which was very much market-based reform, bringing the market principles into government, either privatizing or outsourcing or providing other kinds of market incentives. And I think the idea was that every public organization should follow the same kind of principles of private sector and market-based management. And I think this just didn't take into account a lot of things like the long-term focus of publications, the need to provide there's lots of routine tasks that and things like that, and of course also that many people actually want to expect a public value rather than a specific like service, if you will, from public sector. And I think that was the key sort of a problem, if you will. I think also the problem was that new public management was very much a big reform. And I think that's already a mistake. I think we do today. We don't perhaps want to create one big reform that reforms every public sector organization. I think we want to look at by different areas, if you will, what kind of reforms we need in, let's say, when we look at public finance, when we look at these, when we look at environment. So it might need different kinds of bureaucracies, and that's entirely the point. And of course, that's sort of in the book historically. That's what we show, that this is how it actually happens. That bureaucracies always evolve. And that's really the question: how do we do it now? And that's sort of my proposal, if you will. And I think Alexander's question around neo-Weberian organizations. So Ian mentioned that I think that we see a emergence of a new kinds of organizations that try to combine all three things, if you will. Providing routine tasks and being very entrepreneurial and being activist at the same time. And I called them neo-Weberian organizations. So I could have done at the end that as well. And I think that's really the key here as well. And then part of the book is very much devoted to, if you will, about sort of rethinking Max Weber for our times. And so, yes. And in terms of how do we, when we think about Brazil, of course, I'm not an expert in Brazil. So I think I would very much think about in what kind of areas, what kind of bureaucracies and capabilities we actually need, and try to figure out ways of actually developing slightly different kinds of organizations. Because I think it's also important to learn from different kinds of organizations. And typically, it is very difficult for organizations to do many things at the same time because of organizational culture and capabilities and so on and so forth. So I would try to build different kind of organizations rather than think about one big reform. I would think about different organizations, different organizational capabilities in different places. But yeah, I think in some areas you will find excellent public organizations that are the example of neo-Weberian organizations, trying to bundle all of those capabilities together, and this is something that I was very happy to develop with you, Alexandra, for your paper as well. I think you're muted, Anna. I can't hear.
Hello, Rainer. I was very impressed by your talk, and I'm curious to read your book. My question is about this connection that you made between dynamic capabilities and static capabilities. It sounds interesting, translating something coming from from business management into public management. But I wonder whether the underlying assumption concerning competitiveness can also be, which is the underlying assumption for dynamic capabilities, could also be in the mindset of public management, but more in the sense of the Chinese local governments, which compete with each other, but nothing to do with this. And the question from Anna Celia, when I wonder whether this idea of Wolfgang Streeck, he has, not Wolfgang Streeck, Jens Beckert, he has a contribution about the fictional expectations as the engine of capitalist development. And I was wondering whether we in the global south and developing countries don't have this problem of fictional expectations, and this also tends to cause a.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I mean, I think there is in development economics, there is this phrase which is demonstration effect, so that people, it's especially today, it's so easy to see the living standards in other countries. So it's very difficult to moderate, if you will, the population's demand and development. So if people see how people live in other countries, they want to have the same kind of living standards. And I think that was already in 1950s in development economics. That was one of the key issues, that it's very difficult to say to somebody, you are poorer than others, and you'll get there at one end. So expectation management in that sense is very difficult today, particularly in the new cycle that we live in. But I think in competitiveness, I think you're right in a sense of Chinese competitiveness, which is very much about different local governments being able to do different things. And I think this is where I think the key for today's governance actually is. And I think this whole challenge, how do you help organizations to experiment? Because experimentation in public services and public sector is by nature very difficult, because we have legal requirements, we have routine tasks, we have these things that need to be done in public sector. So experimentation is difficult. And I think partially the idea to look at dynamic capabilities comes from this idea: can we have in public sector those capabilities that are enabling public organizations to be more experimental as well and look for solutions? And that would mean also more bottom-up solutions rather than top-down and things like that. So I think in that sense, competitiveness, yes, but not competitiveness in the sense of new public management reforms, which is basically trying to, if you look at two schools, can we put them in competition with each other? Because that's very often a race to the bottom. And that's where particularly these kind of monetary incentives, that if you get better grades in one school than in other average grades, and you support the school that gets better grades, I think that's very much a race to the bottom in public services. And that's why I wouldn't think about competitiveness in that sense, but competitiveness in terms of how do we enable experimentation in public services. I can't hear.
Agora foi? Hi, Hannah. Nice to meet you again. And I wondered if can you develop a little bit more about the relationship between dynamic capability and the policies around a new model of coalition, social coalition, class coalition, because we are pretty much interested in a new pattern of coalitions to understand those kind of capabilities. Because let me recording your thoughts around the digital platform and how digital platform are doing pretty much harmful effects on the way how political parties or electoral behavior can and will move in the near future. So maybe you can share with us some thought about those issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Carlos, and nice to see you again. It's been a while. As I said, it's always in Brazil. It's great to see old friends. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think as I said, one of the capabilities I think that is really fundamental to public organizations now is around this connecting and coordinating, because I think when we think about 20th century very specialized bureaucracies, they were focused on their own area. So they were focused also their stakeholders that they knew, talking to those stakeholders. Again, if you're like a traffic department in a city, focus on traffic and the stakeholders, which are very much everybody who's sort of dealing with building cars and city planning and things like that. But I think today we require much more connecting with local communities and how you do that in a meaningful way, but also in a transparent way that is not corrupt, and so on and so forth. I think this is again very sort of ambidexterity of public organizations, that you need to be able to engage with communities, which takes a lot of time, but it also takes a lot of skills. We don't usually develop those skills in civil service. We don't teach those skills in civil service, in public administration, in public management. So how do you engage meaningfully, particularly with communities that are underrepresented? It can be based on gender, or race, or recent immigrants. Particularly in many countries, there is lots of recent immigrants. So how do you engage with them? Because they tend to be living in partially the most difficult conditions, of course. Or also the class plays so important role, or should play. But most of the sort of the policy making today is very much focused on the, if you will, like middle classes or even upper middle classes, the standard ways of engaging. So if you want to engage in city planning, you have to have a very good background in architecture and laws and everything like that. That means everybody who has much poorer or has much worse education can't be really participating. So I think these connecting capabilities are incredibly important that we actually don't really develop, because we think they are not civil service capabilities. We think they are capabilities of political system, but I think they need to be part of the civil service as well. And in that sense, this is where the new coalitions should be also partially built. It's not only on the level of politics and social movements, which are very important, and where I think the digital platforms are playing a very harmful role, but it's also on the level of civil service. And I think the examples I brought, like from Bogota or Mexico City, are really interesting and promising examples of engaging and doing things differently in that sense and building those coalitions. The question is, can we scale them into every other city? And that's where I think the federal governments can play an enormously important role. But it's also the similar thing, if you like, for instance, in Germany, you have the similar challenges that you have 11,000 communities, different local governments, and then you have federal government. But how do you build something in between and help the local communities to experiment and build those new coalitions is something that isn't thought about actually at the moment at all. Thank you. I can't hear him. Awesome. Okay. There's...
Hi. Thank you for your lecture. I'm thinking about the relation between the political system, like politicians, and the dynamic capabilities. Because if you want to be a lion, if you want to be a camel, if you want to be a children, you need to have some visionary some
Yeah.
politician
Visionary.
that is visionary. Yeah, and we don't have sometimes. I mean, along the history, we don't. Sometimes we have. So how do you see this relationship between the political system and the dynamic capabilities of the state? Thank you.
Yeah, no, brilliant question. And then, well, you now have again a visionary leader, and and that's a good. But I think that's really some of the challenges that we have when we think about public sector capabilities and capacities, is exactly that we actually do have a dual leadership in public sector. In private sector, you don't really have a dual leadership. In public sector, you have and dual leadership in a sense of you have politicians who are leading, but you also have managers of public organizations, civil servants. So you really have this dual leadership. And I think the question is, how do we balance these things in a meaningful way, so that not every change in political elections can lead to massive sort of dismantling of capabilities, as you have just experienced over the last years, of course, very dramatically. And I think this is where I think we have to think about much more carefully about resilience of those systems. And because I don't think there is like a good recipe to find good leaders. I think sometimes societies are, having good leaders, sometimes they don't, but I think political leaders, but I think you need to have resilience in the system, or balance of power, if you will, between these dual leadership of politicians and bureaucrats. And this, I think we have had in the last decades really have a sort of a dismantling of bureaucratic leadership, I think has been really significant in almost every country. And I think that's really where for me really the key is. But I recognize that political leadership is really important. And this is where, again, the influence of social media and the digital platforms that actually lead to a kind of leadership that we see now proliferating really in many countries. This, you just had a specific president. And I think many countries have the similar kinds of leaders that are taking advantage of the social media characteristics that are really dividing populations rather than trying to build consensus. And that's why I think the social media and its impact on the political community and political leadership is so critical that we need to really focus on that more. In that sense, I don't have a clear answer, unfortunately.
What time is it?
Getting close to the game.
3:30. I think it's time to resume the session. And thank you very much. And also inviting you to come to Brazil next March. Maybe we can have a week of discussions between us, kind of small course, maybe. So let's try to do it on March. Can you come?
Sounds exciting. Yeah, there's always lots of
It's
good
an
things in
invitation. Yes, I think we should
Thank you.
discuss this not online, but on presence, and then continue this elaboration of concepts, because we really need new concepts, new conceptions, and new experiments. Maybe we can prepare some material to discuss and put some reality on the building of the new concepts. I think this is going to be very useful.
Absolutely, and I think there are very exciting times ahead for Brazil, so I hope to be part of these discussions at one point as well. Thank you so much, Anna, and everybody else. Lovely to see you again. Fantastic. Have a great day, and fingers crossed for the football today. All right, thank you so much. Bye-bye.
falar um par de coisas. Agora eu acho que eu posso desligar aqui. Espera um instantinho. Eu acho que a gente pode ficar aqui. Então, eu queria só falar um par de coisas aqui sobre o encontro, porque, enfim, eu acho que a gente tem que agradecer à UNILA por ter sediado esse encontro, que é tão esperado, né? O NUPPAA é o evento talvez mais importante dessa conjugação dos nossos 3 INCTs. É um momento muito importante em que nós abrimos essa possibilidade, né, de muitos trabalhos virem a ser apresentados nos vários temas que decidimos que são os nossos grupos de trabalho do Núcleo de Políticas Públicas, Estratégias e Desenvolvimento. E também porque esses grupos de trabalho eles vão crescendo ao longo do tempo, né? Nós começamos com um número reduzido de grupos, isso vai se ampliando, ampliando. E eu queria chamar a atenção não só para o fato de que isso reflete as reflexões dos 3 INCTs, né? Do INCT de Ciência e Tecnologia, de Políticas Públicas, Estratégia de Desenvolvimento, que é sediado no Instituto de Economia da UFRJ, o Instituto Nacional de Ciência e Tecnologia de Inovação em Doenças Negligenciadas, o INCT-IDPN, que tem sede na Fiocruz e é coordenado pelo professor Carlos Morel, e o INCT Proprietas, que tem sede na Universidade Federal Fluminense e que é coordenado pela professora Márcia Mota. Os 2 professores não puderam estar aqui por motivos, inclusive, bem graves, assim, né? O joelho, o Morel fraturou o joelho e realmente não podia nem comparecer, e a Márcia Mota se encontra em Portugal com muita dificuldade de participar nesse momento, mas manda as suas saudações, né, as boas-vindas a todo mundo aqui. E eu queria também lembrar que esse 5º encontro é um 5º encontro de uma sequência que vale a pena recordar aqui, né? Que o primeiro encontro do NUPPAA ele ocorreu em 1 e 2 de agosto de 2016 e ele tinha como tema o Estado no século XXI, a análise e avaliação de políticas públicas. Ele aconteceu no Rio de Janeiro, na Casa Rui Barbosa e no Instituto de Economia, e teve uma introdução muito bem-vinda do professor Peter Evans. E, naquele momento, a discussão realmente era a discussão do Estado no século XXI. Estávamos inaugurando essa problemática. E foi um evento também com muitas apresentações, muito interessante. O segundo seminário, que ocorreu em 2017, em outubro de 2017, teve como tema Pensando e Repensando Políticas Públicas. Eu acho que essa questão das políticas para o futuro já estava presente nessa preocupação quase 5 anos atrás, né? Que era a ideia do pensar e repensar políticas públicas, também com a ideia da importância da avaliação de políticas públicas e alguma coisa que teve sempre presente, que era a meta-avaliação de políticas públicas, né? A avaliação da avaliação aqui presente. O Alcides Gussi também não pôde participar presencialmente, porque ele está com Covid, ele vinha, mas ele está com Covid, e aqui, então, temos a representação do grupo que vai discutir um dos grupos de trabalho, né? Esse foi o segundo seminário. O terceiro já teve focado sobre capacidades estatais e inovação, e ele aconteceu em 2019, já no CBAE, em 23 e 24 de outubro de 2019, no Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos. Aliás, o segundo seminário também aconteceu no Colégio Brasileiro de Altos Estudos. O quarto seminário, que se chamou Desmonte de Políticas Públicas e Novas Capacidades Estatais para o Futuro Pós-Pandemia, que aconteceu em novembro de 2021, aconteceu todo online, quer dizer, todo virtual, porque nós estávamos ainda em plena pandemia. Então, finalmente, esse quinto encontro, que é a reconstrução das capacidades estatais, novas coalizões e visões de futuro, ele realmente amplia a análise e avaliação de políticas públicas para uma reflexão que é também latino-americana, e nós contamos com algumas presenças, né, de trabalhos que estão sendo apresentados, e nada, por isso, nenhum local melhor do que a UNILA para desenvolver essa discussão que coloca ênfase na questão da interdisciplinaridade e na articulação interinstitucional que nós que é característica, que é marca assim, muito forte do NUPPAA, né? E então eu, enfim, ia falar das questões mais teóricas e tudo mais, mas eu acho que a palestra do Rainer, ela, digamos assim, encaminhou muito bem tanto a questão conceitual como as questões mais de desafios teóricos que nós temos que enfrentar nesse novo momento. Então, eu quero chamar a atenção que nós vamos ter vários encontros ao longo desses dias, né? Chamar a atenção para a apresentação dos livros do livro 1 do nosso projeto de desmonte das políticas públicas, que vai acontecer amanhã, no início da tarde. Hoje, depois do jogo, nós vamos ter a apresentação do que é a difusão de tecnologia, difusão de conhecimentos por parte do CNPq. O Rafael está aqui para nos brindar com essa apresentação, né? Como é que é a difusão tecnológica, não é a divulgação tecnológica por parte do CNPq. Eu acho que é muito importante que o CNPq esteja aqui, porque se trata exatamente disso, né? De como que a gente realiza eventos tão importantes e como é necessário que isso tenha uma repercussão maior do que normalmente a gente consegue, né? Como ampliar o impacto dessas discussões que são tão importantes. Nós vamos ter vários grupos de trabalho, que já aconteceram 3 essa manhã, né? O grupo de políticas sociais, o grupo de agricultura, que vão ficar depois no YouTube ou no Facebook dos nossos. E, então, eu queria chamar a atenção para esses eventos que vão ocorrer ao longo e da dificuldade que a gente tem de fazê-los acontecer nessa forma híbrida, mas que acho que é um esforço necessário, porque queremos que ele atinja um número muito maior de participantes. Então, eu acho que eu quero chamar aqui o Carlos e o Flávio Gaetan, porque eles tiveram um papel muito importante na organização desse evento. E aí a gente depois faz a pausa para o nosso jogo, que é tão importante. Carlos e Flávio, por favor. Não, Flávio, você vai vir aqui. Primeiro, Carlos.
Não, eu não tenho assim muito mais a acrescentar, apenas agradecer aos colegas da UNILA, especialmente o programa de mestrado do curso de Economia, no qual eu passei a participar desde que entrei na universidade no início do ano. Os colegas do mestrado e do curso de Economia foram muito generosos e colaborativos no suporte e apoio institucional à proposta, e acredito que essa relação promete ser bastante frutífera de agora em diante, né? Não só por causa do tema, mas também porque a consolidação institucional da UNILA ela exige um tipo de integração com as redes de pesquisadores do país, e acredito que, nesse sentido, tanto o INCT e o NUPPAA, quanto o programa de mestrado da economia, terão bastante o que ganhar mutuamente, né? E a mesma coisa eu acredito que vale para o programa de mestrado do curso de políticas públicas da UNILA, que no primeiro momento foi bastante interessado e colaborou para que a gente pudesse montar essa agenda, numa época, inclusive, que muitos até diziam, olha, vai fazer calor naquelas semanas e pode ser difícil, então, período de fim de semestre também, com muita gente participando de outros eventos, mas, de qualquer forma, eu acho que a agenda e os trabalhos que foram montados, para nossa surpresa, foi de uma enorme qualidade, com grupos de trabalho e com a agenda da programação, de modo geral, bastante rica. Então, para concluir, assim, estou bem feliz, acho que com a presença de todos e acredito que vai ser uma semana, mais 2 dias, na verdade, muito bons para todos aqui. Flávio.
Bom, agradecer, como o Carlos agradecer aos dois programas, tanto de economia como de políticas públicas. A UNILA foi particularmente, vou passar mais a parte política, que a UNILA foi particularmente afetada nesses 4 anos por muitas razões, Universidade de Fronteira, nova, muito associada, talvez com uma ideologia específica, que não era claramente a ideologia que tinha o governo. Então, para nós é importante fazer atividades acadêmicas, um pequeno ato de resistência. E esses 4 anos a gente usava essa frase de Gramsci, né? Pessimismo da razão, otimismo da vontade. E daqui a 3 semanas, mais ou menos, né? Chegaram depois de 4 anos longos para todos os brasileiros e aqueles que moramos nesse país. E por que falo isso? Porque a Ana Célia me pediu falar 2 livros. Eu acho que a nossa contribuição como rede é ampla, não apenas do NUPPAA, não apenas dos INCTs, mas também do IPEA, agradecendo aqui o IPEA e o CNPq. São esses 3 primeiros volumes que esperamos que sejam apenas os primeiros, uma primeira reflexão. Volumes nos quais vamos a avaliar o desmonte de políticas que ainda bem que está acabando e a política futura, né? Capacidades do Estado, a política futura. E só para acabar, também lançamos recentemente no INCT uma nova publicação que é de Policy Papers, com o intuito de pensar políticas públicas, um pouco com o compromisso da ciência, né? Um prêmio Nobel argentino falava que a ciência não tem país, mas os cientistas sim. Então, o nosso compromisso com esse Brasil que vem, espero que seja.
Agora vamos ao jogo? E agora vamos ao jogo.
E agora vamos